The snow had been holding since noon, and the wind was coming off the north bench hard enough to make the barn siding complain. All 9 horses were inside. I had counted them twice. Stall 12 at the far northwest corner should have been empty. The exterior slider stood nearly 4 feet open. From the protected corner beside stall 10 I could see into 12. Something enormous was standing fully inside it. Wet black hair hung over a torso wider than the stall door. Its head sat low between its shoulders. Its arms reached down its thighs, and when it straightened it did so on 2 legs. The work light caught a face that was neither human nor bear. That was when I knew I was looking at Bigfoot. I stepped backward. It angled through the open north slider, crossed the maintenance apron, and disappeared toward the timber. My grandfather had kept that stall empty every winter for 39 years. Until that night, he had never told me why. My name is Leah Ward. I was 38 when this happened in December of 2025. I manage Blacktail Ridge stables in the Wallowa foothills of northeastern Oregon, though manage is not quite the same thing as own. My grandfather, Amos Ward, still owned the land and most of the buildings. The operating company was mine on paper, and the daily decisions were mine in practice. Amos was 86, sharp enough to read a feed invoice without glasses, and stubborn enough to walk a fence line after I had already paid someone else to inspect it. He lived in a cottage on the lower part of the property. I lived in the old manager house about 80 yards south of the barn. Between us sat 55 acres, 8 boarded horses, 1 retired red gelding named Copper, and a barn whose northernmost stall had been kept off the market for as long as I could remember. The barn stood near the upper edge of the cleared ground. South of it were the drive, the manager house, and the paddocks we used most often. North of it, a maintenance apron ended in a strip of uneven ground before connected timber began roughly 50 yards away. There was no road on that side and no public trail. The exterior door at stall 12 faced that dark strip directly. By the fall of 2025, the walls, floor, wiring, and exterior slider in stall 12 were in better condition than those in several occupied bays. It was probably the best isolated space in the building. The barn had 12 original bays arranged along a central aisle. Over the years, 2 of those bays had been converted for utility and service use. Stall 12 remained a stall, tucked into the northwest corner with its own exterior sliding door, and no horse directly beside it. In summer, we used it briefly for storage, repairs, or an animal that needed to stand apart for an hour. Once winter settled in, the hook outside its door stayed bare. That arrangement had always irritated me, but it had never cost enough to make me challenge it seriously. Then the roof trusses needed work. The repair was finished in early October. The invoice came to $12,400, payable before the end of the year. The number sat on my desk beside the winter feed projections and made every underused square foot on the property look different. Winter was when a small stable exposed every weak assumption in its budget. Hay cost more, turnout took longer, water systems demanded attention, and daylight disappeared before the work did. One empty stall could be sensible. One empty stall that could cover more than a third of a repair invoice began to look like a management failure. I did not decide that day to break a family rule. I decided to make an empty stall earn money. At the time, those felt like 2 separate choices. Blacktail Ridge was a working stable, not a family museum. We boarded horses for people who lived in town, kept a small lesson schedule in better weather, and took occasional short-term referrals when another facility needed a quiet place for a healthy horse. The work was ordinary and repetitive in the way animal care has to be. Water, feed, bedding, gates, latches, records, and then the same list again before dark. I had run those details since 2021. Amos still handled pasture leases and larger property decisions, but he no longer climbed haystacks or took the midnight call when a water heater failed. Our arrangement worked because I respected what was his and he generally admitted what had become mine. Stall 12 sat exactly between those categories. 2 days after the roof invoice arrived, I carried a copy down to his cottage. He was at the kitchen table repairing a leather halter that should have been discarded 10 years earlier. "I know what the roof cost," he said before I sat down. "Then you know why I am looking for winter income." "You are always looking for winter income." "Usually I have a stall to sell." He pulled the thread tight with a pair of small pliers. You have 9 horses and 10 usable stalls. I have 9 horses and 9 stalls you permit me to use once the weather turns. That made him stop. I set the invoice beside his coffee. 12 has the best separation in the barn, no shared horse wall on the north end, exterior access. Newer electrical than half the south row. If I line it properly, I can take a premium layup horse without changing the border arrangement. No. You did not even ask what kind of horse. Doesn't matter. It matters to the person paying us. Amos laid the halter flat. His hands were square and heavy at the knuckles, with pale seams from old wire cuts. I had watched those hands repair nearly everything on the property. When he did not reach for the invoice, I understood that his objection was not going to be financial. Once the snow holds and the wind comes off the north bench, stall 12 stays empty, he said. He used the sentence exactly as he had when I was a child. Not similar words, the same words in the same order. Why? Because that is the rule. A rule is not a reason. It kept horses out of trouble. What trouble? Draft, ice, a bad door, those are repair problems. He looked toward the north-facing kitchen window. From his cottage, the upper half of the barn roof was visible beyond a line of firs. Keep a horse out of that stall in winter, he said. Use another one. There isn't another one. He returned to the halter. The conversation was over as far as he was concerned. I left angry but not frightened. Amos had given me no story about an animal in the barn, no warning about the timber, and no claim that something returned in storms. He had repeated an old operating rule and refused to explain it. That was unusual between us. Amos could be difficult, but he normally argued from a task. He would show me a cracked hinge, a drainage line, or a horse that loaded badly and expect the physical problem to settle the discussion. With 12, he offered only a sentence he had inherited from himself. That mattered later. It is easy to turn every silence into a warning once you know how a story ends. At the time, his refusal sounded like the kind of inherited caution that outlives whatever first made it useful. The north stall had once been exposed to more draft. The old exterior door had once fit badly. Before the 1998 renovation, another horse bay had stood beside it. Amos had spent decades repairing those conditions. I believed he had kept the conclusion after removing the cause. From the barn aisle that afternoon, stall 12 looked clean, dry, and needlessly vacant. I stood inside it with a tape measure and made a list. My earliest memory of stall 12 is not of anything strange. It is of a brass number. I was 6, small enough that the top half of every stall door felt like a wall. Amos had polished the brass plates along the west row, and 12 caught the winter light at the end of the aisle. The stalls below it had name cards and halters hanging from hooks. 12 had a blank card holder and a bare hook. I asked which horse lived there. None right now, Amos said. Which one lived there before? Different ones. Which one is coming next? Not this winter. That was 1993, the first year I later found the vacancy written into his stable ledger. On a page listing feed orders, board payments, and farrier dates, he had added a plain note, number 12 vacant December through thaw. There was no explanation beside it. For most of my childhood, the empty stall seemed less like a mystery than one of Amos's personal habits. He kept gate chains hanging with both hooks facing inward. He never stored hay against an exterior wall. He drained the north hydrant before the first hard freeze, even after we installed heat tape. An empty stall belonged to the same category, something he had learned through inconvenience and no longer wished to debate. By 17, I had stopped accepting that answer. The winter of 2004 was busy. We had more horses on the property then, and a mare in stall 9 had begun kicking whenever the gelding across the aisle crowded his door. I wanted to move the gelding to 12 for a week. Every other solution created work. Moving the mare meant changing her turnout group. Moving Copper's predecessor meant disrupting an older horse that had finally settled. 12 was empty, clean, and separated by the service bay. To a 17-year-old who already believed she understood barn management, Amos's refusal looked less like caution than control. Amos refused. The divider is solid now, I told him. The drain works. The north slider is better than the south doors. What exactly is wrong with it? Nothing is wrong with the stall. Then put the gelding in it. No. He moved the gelding somewhere else and left 12 empty. That same winter, after a wet snow, I found a dark scrape on the interior wall liner near the north slider. One corner of the sliding panel sat an inch out of line. I showed Amos, expecting the damage to prove that the door still had a mechanical problem. He studied the scrape, checked the bottom guide, and reset the panel. "Wind load," he said. "Then why keep the stall if the door is bad?" "The door isn't bad." That answer frustrated me more than the first. He repaired the guide the following week, yet the stall remained empty until spring. That winter gave me no sighting and no sound beyond the usual noises of a barn in weather. The scrape might have come from lumber stored there the previous summer, and the panel might have shifted under snow pressure. Nothing from that night deserved to become evidence of what I saw 21 years later. What stayed with me was Amos's reaction. He had checked the opening before he checked the wall. When I became the daily manager, I went through decades of his records to move our accounts into one system. The winter vacancy appeared year after year. Sometimes he wrote it in the stall list. Sometimes he simply left number 12 blank. There were repair entries for the north door, the wall liner, the floor, and the 1998 conversion. There were no entries for animals, footprints, or unexplained damage. The oldest formal vacancy note I found was from 1993. When I asked Amos why it began then, he corrected me. "It didn't," he said. "That is when I started writing it down." When did it begin? He took longer than usual to answer. December of '86. I was not born until the following spring. Amos did not tell me what happened in 1986 when I first asked. He only gave me the date and repeated the rule. The full account came after my own night in stall 12. By then he was not trying to persuade me, and I was not searching for a reason to ignore him. I asked him to describe only what he had seen, where he had stood, and what he had done next. This is the account he gave me. On December 14, 1986, a storm came down from the north bench after dark. The barn still had all 12 original horse bays. Stall 12 occupied the same northwest corner, but its exterior opening used an older wooden panel that dragged in its track. The bay directly south of it was still a stall then. Neither space held a horse that night. The nearest gelding had been moved farther south because Amos was repairing a hydrant connection and chasing a cold draft near the north wall. That detail was not luck arranged for the story. It was one of the practical conditions that later convinced him an empty corner had prevented something worse. Near midnight, he went from the house to check the repair. Snow had collected against the north side of the barn. The wind pressed at the siding in long gusts, then dropped away so abruptly he could hear the horses shifting inside. He entered through the south doors. Snow came in with him and melted across the first section of aisle. He latched the doors behind him, stamped his boots, and waited for his eyes to adjust before going farther. That small pause was part of his normal routine. It also meant he was certain the dark shape at the north end had not followed him through the entrance. The aisle lights in 1986 were weak incandescent bulbs behind wire cages. From the south end, the final two west stalls disappeared into alternating bands of yellow light and shadow. Amos walked north far enough to see the hydrant area. Nothing leaked. The horses behind him were awake, but they were not panicking. Several had turned their heads toward the empty end of the aisle. Then the exterior panel at stall 12 moved. He described the sound as wood grinding over packed grit, not a slam, not a latch being worked. The panel shifted, stopped, and shifted again under a force he could not see from the aisle. His first thought was that the wind had pulled the old door out of its guide. He advanced until roughly 30 feet remained between him and the stall opening. From there, he could see that the panel stood farther open than he remembered leaving it. Snow blew through the gap and melted in a narrow shine across the floor. Something dark occupied part of the stall. At first, he saw only a broad mass near the exterior wall. He thought a horse had gotten loose, though every horse was behind him and every occupied latch had already been checked. Then he thought a black bear might have pushed inside, even though the shape was too high and the season was wrong for a bear to be moving casually through a lit barn. The mass shifted. One section separated from the shadow and hung downward like an arm. A second dark length appeared on the other side. The upper body rose until the shape was no longer crouched within the opening, but standing partly inside the stall. The figure stayed out of the aisle and made no move toward him. It simply became upright. Amos stopped where he was. Behind him, a horse struck one hoof against a stall mat. Another blew hard through its nose. The sound traveled up the aisle, and the dark figure turned slightly toward it. That was the moment Amos understood that he was standing between an unknown animal and the south end of the barn, while the north opening offered the only direct route back outside. He did not move closer. At 30 feet under poor light and blowing snow, Amos never saw what I later saw. He was careful about that distinction. He saw the outline of wet hair along a shoulder. He saw a head carried low without the long neck of a horse or the pointed ears he expected from a bear. He saw a torso broad enough to fill much of the opening and one arm hanging below the level where a person's hand should have been. He smelled wet earth, old leaves, and something animal beneath the ordinary barn odors. The face remained indistinct. He could not give me a reliable height and never claimed the figure looked him in the eye. When I asked if he knew it was Bigfoot, he shook his head. "I knew it wasn't one of my horses," he said. "I knew I shouldn't crowd it, that was enough." Amos backed toward the south doors one measured step at a time. His concern was not that the figure would chase him. He was worried that it would move into the aisle, where the occupied stalls narrowed every choice available to him. The figure remained near the north opening. When Amos reached the middle of the barn, he stopped beside an occupied stall and listened. He had no firearm with him. The phone was in the house, and there was no one else on the property to call from the barn. Going outside and circling north would have placed him near the opening, so he stayed south and kept the route clear. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the old panel scraped again. The horses reacted before Amos saw movement. Heads lifted over doors. One mare stepped backward into her bedding. A gelding gave a short, sharp call that Amos had heard from him only when an unfamiliar animal came near the fence. The dark figure lowered itself and passed through the exterior opening. Amos saw a shoulder cross the gap, then a long arm. The panel did not close behind it. Snow continued to blow across the empty floor. He waited until the horses began to lower their heads. He checked each latch from the aisle and left through the south doors. He did not walk around the barn. He did not follow tracks into the timber. He returned to the house and watched the north tree line from a window until daylight. The next morning, the storm had softened nearly everything outside. The wooden slider stood wider than he believed he had left it. The bottom edge had ridden partly over its guide. Melted snow and dark forest debris streaked the stall floor. Beyond the maintenance side of the barn, he found several broad depressions leading toward the trees, but wind had rounded them until he could not say whether they were footprints, places where snow dropped from branches, or breaks in the drift made by something heavy. Morning offered no blood, no material he could collect, and no clear track. No horse had been damaged because no horse had occupied that corner. Amos repaired the panel and said nothing publicly. I asked him why he had not told my grandmother, the neighbors, or anyone who might have helped identify what he saw. "I told your grandmother I found the north door open," he said. "That was true." "Why not tell her the rest?" "Because I couldn't prove the rest and I still had a barn to run." He also had a child due the following spring, limited money, and a reputation tied to the safety of other people's animals. A story about a huge upright animal inside his barn could have brought curiosity, ridicule, armed visitors, or frightened customers. None of those would have improved the north door. So he made the one decision he could control. When winter weather established itself, stall 12 would hold no horse. If the opening moved again, an animal inside the stall would not be trapped against another animal. If nothing ever returned, the only cost would be one unused bay for part of the year. He had not created a sanctuary. He had not left food. He did not even know whether the figure had entered the stall before that night or would ever enter it again. He had seen an uncertain danger in a confined space and removed the horse from the equation. For 39 winters, that was the entire rule. The winters immediately after 1986 were quiet. That was another point Amos insisted on. He did not claim something came to the barn every December. He did not sit awake waiting for it, and he did not build his life around a single night. He repaired the old north panel, kept stall 12 empty once snow remained on the ground, and continued operating the stable. In spring and summer, the stall returned to ordinary use. He stacked temporary fencing in it. He kept a mare there for an afternoon while a partition was repaired. One August, it held boxes from the house during a plumbing job. Winter was different because winter recreated the conditions he remembered. Persistent snow, wind descending from the north bench, and a dark route from connected timber to the exterior opening. From 1987 through 1992, he kept the rule in his head. My grandmother knew only that he disliked boarding a horse in the north corner during severe weather. I grew up hearing the final sentence without knowing the event behind it. Keeping 12 vacant was easier in some years than others. When the stable was full, Amos turned away winter money or rearranged horses farther south. When business was slow, the blank space cost almost nothing. That changing burden may be why he wrote the rule into the ledger in 1993. Memory was no longer enough when every open bay had a price. Once the snow holds and the wind comes off the north bench, stall 12 stays empty. It was not attached to a date on the calendar. A light October dusting did not count, neither did one night of flurries that melted by morning. Amos meant the point when the ground stayed white and the north wind had a clear run against the barn. In 1993, after our winter board count became more complicated, he began recording the vacancy. The entry was an operating note, not a warning to future generations. Number 12 stayed blank in the board column. Feed totals reflected one fewer available stall. When a customer asked, Amos said the space was seasonal or under maintenance. Most winters produced nothing unusual. That sentence deserves emphasis because memory compresses quiet years. I can list minor things that bothered him, but not one of them proves a return. A slider found farther open after a gale. Wet needles on a floor near an exterior gap. Horses looking north during a storm. All of those can happen in a rural barn without requiring an unknown animal. Once, sometime before the 1998 work, Amos found disturbed bedding in 12 even though no horse had used it for several weeks. The old panel had shifted in its upper track. There was moisture along the inside wall and a dark mark where something may have rubbed the wood. No figure was present. Snow had blown against the opening and the roof edge had shed debris. He cleaned the stall, reset the door, and added the repair to a growing list of reasons to rebuild the north end. I asked whether that incident made him believe the animal had returned. It made me believe the door needed work, he said. That answer was consistent with him. He did not use uncertainty to make a stronger story. He treated a mechanical problem as mechanical and preserved the vacancy because the consequence of being wrong could involve a horse. By the late 90s, the barn's layout no longer matched our operation. We needed electrical storage, a place for tools and blankets, and a protected space where a veterinarian or farrier could work without tying up the center aisle. Amos used that need to solve several north end problems at once. The renovation would change 2 stalls into service areas and replace the old exterior panel. It would also remove nearly every practical explanation I later used to dismiss his rule. The 1998 renovation took most of September. I was 11 and spent more time in the way than I spent helping. I remember sawhorses across the aisle, extension cords over the rafters, and Amos arguing with a carpenter about how much clearance a sliding panel needed after wet snow froze beneath it. The original 12-bay shape remained visible, but 2 stalls stopped housing horses. On the east row, former stall 6 became a utility room at the north end. On the west row, former stall 11 became an open service buffer used for equipment, hoofwork, and access beside stall 10. Stall 12 remained beyond it in the northwest corner. The changes mattered for animal separation. A horse in 12 no longer shared its south partition with another horse. Across the aisle, the utility bay held no animal. The stall could be approached from the central aisle through the service space, while its exterior north slider still opened onto the maintenance apron. Amos replaced the dragging wooden panel with a custom metal-framed slider clad to match the barn. It moved on an overhead track and seated against a lower guide. A stop kept it from traveling beyond its intended range. New wall liner protected the interior. The floor was corrected near the threshold, and the north electrical circuit was improved. When the work was finished, I walked into 12 and announced that it was now the best stall in the barn. "Maybe," Amos said. "So we can use it this winter." No. The renovation had never been intended to cancel the rule. It had been intended to make the north end safer and more useful around the rule. By 2004, that distinction made no sense to me. The new slider had survived 6 winters. The drainage was better. The adjacent bay was gone. When I found the panel slightly out of line and the scrape on the liner, Amos repaired the guide instead of treating it as anything unexplained. To me, he had disproved his own fear and refused to accept the result. To him, repairs reduced ordinary risks. They did not erase the one risk he could not measure. The disagreement went dormant as I built a life away from the stable. I left for college, worked at larger equine facilities, and returned with more formal habits than Amos liked. I made checklists. I tracked feed waste. I required signed emergency contacts instead of accepting that everyone in the county knew everyone else. In 2018, we formed Blacktail Ridge Stables LLC to separate the operating business from the property Amos still owned. In 2021, I took over daily management. The transfer required hundreds of decisions about insurance, maintenance, customer records, and animal care. Stall 12 was never formally transferred into my winter inventory. I tolerated that because outside the winter rule we could arrange 10 horse spaces around 9 regular occupants. The open bay gave us flexibility for cleaning, short separations, and emergencies. Once the rule activated, all 9 permitted winter stalls were occupied. The loss was real but not painful enough to fight over. Then the truss inspection found movement above the center section of the roof. The repair could not wait through another heavy snow year. I authorized the work, and by October the barn was structurally sound with a $12,400 invoice attached to it. Nothing about stall 12 had changed that fall. Our financial margin had. When I proposed converting it for a winter layup horse, I was not chasing an extra luxury. I was trying to recover part of an unavoidable expense from a space already separated better than anything else we owned. Amos saw the same numbers I did. He still told me to leave the stall empty. The opportunity came through Mara Quinn, a horse trainer who had referred clients to us before. She called in late October about a healthy performance gelding whose owner wanted a quiet 6-month winter layup. The horse was not recovering from surgery and did not require medical supervision. He needed controlled turnout, consistent handling, and a stall away from the social pressure of a busier training barn. Mara had seen our operation and knew I did not accept horses beyond our capacity. She sent vaccination records, handling notes, and a turnout history before I offered a rate. Nothing in the file suggested a difficult or dangerous animal. This was exactly the kind of limited referral that could improve winter revenue without changing the character of the stable. Stall 12 fit the request almost perfectly. "What are you charging?" Mara asked. $750 a month if they want the isolated space and daily handling. For 6 months? December through May. I'll send them the agreement. The gross contract value was $4,500. The owner paid a $1,500 advance to hold a December 20th arrival date. That advance was not additional income. It was part of the total and refundable if I could not provide the agreed space. Before signing, I inspected the stall with the same standards I would have used anywhere else. The structure was sound. The electrical circuit worked, the floor drained, the exterior slider needed adjustment, but it did not need replacement. The conversion cost $5,700. The largest portion went to the floor and new mats, $1,850. Wall liner and padding cost $1,650. A safer work light, temperature sensor, and electrical updates added $1,400. Partition and slider labor took the remaining $800. Those improvements were not cosmetic. A valuable horse needed footing that would not shift, protected walls, reliable light, and a safe barrier between the stall and the service area. The work also left the space useful even if the original contract ended after 6 months. During the slider adjustment, the contractor removed an old secondary stop pin that had become bent and difficult to seat. The primary track stop remained. We ordered a replacement pin, but it did not arrive with the other hardware. I treated that as a minor unfinished item. The panel still moved correctly by hand and sat where I placed it. It could not leave the track under normal travel. The missing secondary stop affected how firmly we could secure its nearly closed position, not whether the stall had a functioning exterior wall. Amos came through the barn while the new mats were being fitted. "You signed the horse?" he asked. "Arrival is December 20th. He looked at the padded walls, then at the north slider. "Snow will hold before then. The stall is safer than it was in '98. "That isn't what I said." "I know exactly what you said." Amos had the standing to challenge a permanent change to his building, but he let the work continue. The operating company had paid for it, and I was responsible for the contract. When he left, he touched the bare brass hook beside the door as if confirming that I had not hung a halter there yet. I told myself his concern belonged to a barn that no longer existed. The old wooden panel was gone. The neighboring horse stall was gone. We had exterior lighting, better latches, and a sensor that would notify me if the temperature dropped unexpectedly. I had addressed every risk he had ever named. What I had not done was ask why his rule began in 1986. He had refused once, and I had stopped pressing because I assumed the answer would be another version of wind, ice, or a frightened horse. The gelding was due in less than 8 weeks. By early December, the work was complete except for the replacement stop pin. Stall 12 stood clean, padded, and empty, waiting for an animal that had not yet reached the property. On December 17th, the first lasting snow of that winter moved in before noon. We had already seen flurries, but they had melted from the lower fields. This storm covered the maintenance apron, filled the shallow ruts north of the barn, and stayed. The wind came from the north-northeast, sliding off the bench and striking the building almost squarely at stall 12. I recognized the conditions from Amos's sentence. I also knew the customer gelding was 3 days away. The stall had passed my inspection, and no horse would occupy it that night. I saw no reason to cancel a signed contract because a family rule had reached its trigger before the arrival date. My evening feed took longer than usual. Snow stuck to my coat each time I crossed between buildings, and the horses drank more slowly in the cold. I worked from south to north, checking each animal and latch as I went. On the east row, 4 boarders occupied stalls 1 through 4. Copper, Amos's retired red gelding, stood in stall 5. Beyond him, the former 6th bay held electrical panels, supplies, and the north hydrant access. Across the aisle, 4 more boarders occupied stalls 7 through 10. The old 11th bay was the service buffer. Stall 12 waited beyond it at the northwest corner. 9 horses, no horse beside 12, no horse across from it. I cleaned the last loose shavings from the new mat and tested the interior light. The temperature sensor on the north wall showed 34 degrees, close to the rest of the barn. I checked the slider because snow had begun collecting against its outside edge. The panel moved freely. I pulled it nearly shut, leaving only the normal narrow ventilation gap at the frame. Without the secondary pin, I could not lock that position as firmly as I intended once a horse arrived. For an empty stall, I considered it sufficient. I remember placing both hands on the panel and giving it one extra pull. I remember the edge settling near the jamb. I did not measure the remaining gap, and I did not photograph it. The north wind pressed against the outside face while I stood there. The panel trembled once in the track, but did not travel. I moved it open several inches, pulled it back again, and watched the lower guide seat. Had it drifted in front of me, I would have blocked the stall from use and called the contractor that evening. That became important because later I could only compare what I saw with my memory. I shut off the light in 12, walked south, and secured the main barn doors behind me. The manager house was 80 or 90 yards away, close enough that I could see the barn's exterior lamps through the snowfall. Before leaving, I paused at the aisle center and listened. The horses were eating. Copper knocked hay from his feeder and shook it from his forelock. Nothing in the north end moved except a faint vibration from wind against the siding. Whatever entered later was not visible or audible to me then. At the house, I changed my wet boots and made notes from the feed round. The wind increased after dark. Every few minutes a gust pressed against the north side of the house and sent powder across the windows. At 9:47, my phone showed a low temperature alert from stall 12. The sensor reading had dropped several degrees faster than the rest of the barn. A dead battery would have produced a connection warning. A power failure would have affected the work light circuit. A sharp temperature change usually meant outside air was entering where it should not. My first thought was the unfinished slider stop. I put my boots back on and walked to the barn. The shortest route from the house led to the south doors. I used it automatically. Circling around the building to check the exterior slider first would have taken me across the dark north apron, where snow was blowing hard enough to hide the ground. From inside, I could inspect the horses and approach the problem under light. I left my phone on the kitchen counter after acknowledging the alert. I expected to be gone for 5 minutes and believed I was going to reseat a door. I took no weapon or camera. When I opened the south entrance, warm barn air moved past me. Under the smell of hay, leather, and manure was a colder odor I could not place at first. Wet leaves, mud exposed beneath snow, the heavy animal smell of a coat that had been soaked and never dried. The sound inside was wrong as well. A barn holding 9 horses is never silent. There should have been chewing, a chain touching wood, the shift and sigh of weight moving from one hind leg to the other. I heard the fans in the wind, but the horses themselves seemed to be listening. The aisle lights were already on their night setting. Every horse I could see was standing. They were not throwing themselves against doors. That would have sent me back outside for help. Instead, they held a tense stillness that was almost worse. Ears pointed north, heads raised. Copper stood at the front of stall 5 with his nostrils wide. I closed the south doors behind me so no horse could reach open ground if a latch failed. Then I checked the occupied stalls in order. 1 through 5 were secure. 7 through 10 were secure. No animal had escaped into the aisle. No person answered when I called once toward the north end. Every occupied stall stayed closed. Releasing a frightened horse into a confined aisle would have multiplied the problem before I knew what it was. At the center of the barn, I saw a pale stripe of moving snow through stall 12. From that position, the geometry was plain. The stripe lay beyond the west row service buffer, not in the east utility room and not in an occupied bay. Nothing could reach the north slider from inside the barn without passing through stall 12 or coming down the aisle in front of me. The exterior slider was open much farther than I had left it. Wind could move a panel without a secondary stop. I understood that. What stopped me was not the gap itself but the way the service buffer beside stall 10 had gone dark. Something interrupted the spill from the north work light, creating a vertical shadow across the opening into 12. I moved along the west side until the corner of the former stall 11 protected most of my body. From there, I was roughly 25 feet from 12. A solid partition edge and the front of stall 10 stood between me and the open center of the aisle. I listened. There was a slow scrape from inside the stall, followed by the soft compression of weight on rubber matting. A loose horse was still the most familiar explanation, even though I had counted all 9. A black bear was possible in the region, though it should not have been standing quietly inside a lit barn during a storm. A person in dark winter clothing made even less sense, but I considered it. I leaned just far enough to see through the service space. At first, the shape inside 12 blended with the north wall. It was darker than the wet siding behind it, and broad enough that I could not identify separate legs. Snow moved through the open slider around its outline. The shape shifted toward the aisle light. One arm came into view. It hung too low for a person of any height I could make fit beneath that roof, and there was no sleeve, glove, or edge of clothing on it. Then the rest of the body straightened. It was fully inside the stall. That is the clearest fact I can give you about the encounter. I was not looking through trees at a distant shape. I was not watching something cross a road through a windshield. The animal stood on the new rubber mats I had installed, beneath a work light I had paid an electrician to replace. The light was not bright enough to show every feature. Snow entering through the slider broke it into moving bands, and the animal's wet hair absorbed more light than it reflected. But at 23 to 28 feet, with the service partition protecting me, I could see the whole body. Its hair was darkest across the torso and shoulders, wet enough to separate into heavy strands. The chest looked deep rather than narrow. Its shoulders rose around a head carried low, giving the neck almost no visible length. The arms reached far down the thighs, ending in hands I could see only as dark shapes against the lighter floor. I will not assign it a height. The roof, the mat, and the stall fixtures gave me references, but I was crouched behind a partition and the animal changed posture while I watched. Any exact number would pretend to be more reliable than my memory is. What I can say is that no person in winter clothing could have produced those proportions. There was no coat hem, no hood, no backpack, no reflected strip, and no separation between clothing and skin. It was covered in hair from the shoulders to the legs. The head turned toward the occupied barn. For an instant the work light reached the side of its face. I saw a heavy brow, a broad flat plane through the middle, and dark skin where the hair thinned. The features did not project like a bear's muzzle. They sat forward in a way that was disturbingly close to a human face without becoming one. That was the point at which every ordinary explanation failed together. I thought the word Bigfoot. I kept the word to myself. My mouth had gone dry, and I was concentrating on keeping my boots from scraping the concrete beneath the service mat. The animal did not charge me. It did not bare its teeth or strike the walls. It stood with one side angled toward the open north panel and the other toward the aisle, as if measuring both routes. Stall 12 was large enough to contain it, but not large enough to make the situation feel distant. The padded liner I had installed compressed slightly where one shoulder brushed it. A loose edge of the new floor mat had lifted near the threshold, and dirty meltwater gathered in the shallow line beneath it. I thought about the gelding due on December 20th. Had he arrived 3 days earlier, he would have occupied that exact space. The exterior door would likely have been pinned more securely once the replacement hardware came, but he also would have been enclosed behind an interior stall door with a large unknown animal sharing the bay or pressing toward its only open route. That image made my next decision simple. I would not close the north slider, I would not move into the aisle, I would not open any horse's door. The animal shifted its weight, and one foot became visible beneath the hair of its lower leg. It was broad and dark against the mat. I could not see toes clearly, and I will not claim that I did. Its attention moved from the horses to me. I knew it had located my position because the head stopped and the shoulders aligned slightly toward the service corner. I did not feel recognized in any human sense. I felt assessed by an animal that had discovered the route south was occupied. The open slider was behind its right shoulder. Beyond it lay the narrow maintenance apron, and 45 or 50 yards farther north, connected timber. I took one slow step backward. The animal lowered its head and turned toward the exterior gap. I continued backing south while keeping the partition between us. The horses made the movement difficult to judge. Copper shifted in stall 5. A boarder's mare rattled her door with one nervous touch of her muzzle. Each small barn sound seemed loud enough to trigger a rush, but the animal in 12 did not enter the aisle. It chose the opening that already existed. To pass through, it lowered its upper body and turned slightly. One shoulder crossed the gap, then the head, torso, and trailing arm. I saw no careful manipulation of hardware. It did not grip a latch or slide the panel. The opening was already wide enough, and it used that space. For less than a second, the exterior light outlined it against the blowing snow. Then it stepped onto the maintenance apron. It moved on 2 legs with a long, controlled stride. There was no drop to all fours and no stumbling transition. It crossed beyond the edge of the light, traveled north, and vanished into the dark band before the trees. I did not follow it to the opening. Instead, I retreated to the middle of the barn and waited. My phone was back at the house, and reaching it meant leaving by the south doors. Even then, anyone driving to Blacktail Ridge would have taken time, and I did not know whether the animal had stopped beyond the light. I also did not want a deputy, neighbor, or curious friend arriving from an exterior route while I could not describe where it had gone. I kept my body turned enough to watch both the north end and the occupied doors. The slider remained open. Snow hissed across the threshold, but no second shape appeared and nothing moved back from the trees. The absence of movement did not make me willing to approach the gap. It only gave the horses time to settle. My immediate responsibility was the 9 horses already inside. I checked their latches again from the aisle. None appeared injured. No stall wall showed fresh damage. Their breathing gradually slowed, though every head remained pointed north. I stayed away from 12. I did not switch on its brighter work light, inspect the floor, or touch the slider. Anything I learned in those first minutes was less important than avoiding another encounter at the north opening. After roughly 15 minutes, I left through the south doors and walked back to the manager house. I locked the door, turned off the interior lights facing north, and called Amos. He answered on the fourth ring. "Are the horses in?" he asked, after I told him there had been an animal in the barn. "All 9, every latch is closed." "Any hurt?" "Not that I could see." "Where did it go?" "Out the north slider, toward the timber." He was silent. "Amos, it was standing inside 12. You are in the house now?" "Yes." "Stay there. Do not go around the north side. We will look when it is light." "You know what I saw." "I know where you saw it." He would not explain more over the phone. I asked if he was coming up, and he said no. Walking from his cottage in the storm would have put him outside between the barn and the lower drive, with no information about where the animal had gone. At dawn he would come by the south route. I sat at the kitchen table where I could see the barn lights through the snow. Twice I thought a shadow moved near the north wall. Neither time could I separate movement from branches and blowing powder. The temperature sensor slowly climbed after I acknowledged the alert. The reading never returned fully to the other barn zone, which made sense with the slider open. I wrote down the alert time, the time I reached the barn, and the time I called Amos. The notes were rough and made while my hand still shook. They did not prove what I had seen, but they kept the sequence from changing as I replayed it through the night. Sleep was impossible. Before sunrise, the wind weakened. The storm had already begun covering whatever crossed the apron. Amos reached the manager house shortly after first light. He had driven up the lower lane instead of walking, then parked south of the barn. We watched the tree line from inside for several minutes. Nothing moved except snow falling from fir branches. "Tell me where you stood," he said. I showed him through the window first. South entrance, west side, service corner beside stall 10. I pointed out the north opening and the route the animal had taken. Only after we agreed that the apron appeared clear did we enter through the south doors. The horses were tired and alert. Copper had eaten part of his hay. The mare in stall 8 had pushed bedding into a ridge near her door. No animal showed a cut, swelling, broken latch, or sign of direct contact. We approached the north end together. The slider stood between 46 and 48 inches open. I measured it later, after the initial inspection, because I wanted a number for the repair order. I could not prove how wide it had been when I finished chores. My memory was of a nearly closed panel with a narrow ventilation space, not an opening wide enough for the body I saw. The missing secondary stop pin left several possible causes. Wind pressure could have worked the panel along the track. Vibration from repeated gusts might have changed its position. The animal could have leaned against it from outside or inside without understanding the mechanism. I cannot separate those possibilities now. The matte edge near the exterior threshold had shifted. Dirty meltwater ran beneath it, carrying fir needles, grit, and fragments of dark leaf material from outside. One padded wall panel showed a damp smear at shoulder level, but there was no usable print in it. On the apron, wind had softened a series of broad hollows leading north. Some appeared longer than the round depressions left by falling clumps of snow. None preserved edges, toes, or a consistent sequence well enough to document as a trackway. We found no hair that could be collected and identified. There was no blood, tissue, clear footprint, damaged hardware, or image from a camera. The stable did not have surveillance coverage on that side, and my phone had remained in the house during the encounter. I photographed the slider, mat, floor, and apron before we cleaned anything. In the images, the hollows look less impressive than they did at dawn. Scale disappears in flat snow, and the wind had already erased the edges. I keep the photographs with the repair record, but I would not ask anyone to identify an animal from them. What remained was exactly what I had feared it would be: one direct observation, an altered opening with ambiguous debris, and a family record showing that Amos had kept the same stall vacant in winter for decades. The records proved the vacancy. They did not prove the reason. We stood inside 12 while cold air moved around us. Amos looked smaller than he had the previous fall. Not confused or defeated, just old enough that the distance between 1986 and that morning could be seen in the way he rested one hand against the partition. "Tell me what happened the first time," I said. That was when he gave me the account of the December storm before I was born. He kept it bounded, 30 feet of aisle, poor light. A broad, dark body partly inside, one low head, wet hair, and an arm that hung wrong for a person. He had seen no face clearly and had never named the animal. "You saw more than I did," he said when he finished. "You kept this stall empty for 39 years because of that one night?" "Because I could leave it empty. Most years nothing happened. Most years the rule cost one stall." That answer would have irritated me before my encounter. Standing in the converted space, I finally understood its logic. Amos had not needed certainty about the animal. He needed only to compare the cost of vacancy with the possible cost of trapping a horse in the same corner. The customer gelding was due in 2 days. I still had no proof I could offer Mara or the owner. I also could not honestly tell them the exterior access was secure for winter occupancy. Lack of proof did not make the stall safe enough to sell. I spent that morning testing every explanation that did not require the word Bigfoot. A person would have needed to cross private property in a storm, enter through a resistant exterior panel, stand silently among alarmed horses without a light, and leave for the timber without clothing visible on the body. No footprints from boots led to the barn, and nothing had been stolen. A bear fit the smell, hair, and strength needed to pressure a door. It did not fit the upright posture, the proportions, the flat forward face, or the controlled two-legged departure I observed. A horse could not have appeared in an empty stall while all 9 remained locked in their assigned bays. Wind explained the slider better than it explained the body. None of those conclusions created evidence I could show a customer. They only told me I could not proceed as though the night had been a harmless sensor failure. I called Mara before 9. "I have to cancel the layup placement," I said. "Is there a problem with the gelding?" "No, the problem is our exterior access. The north slider changed position during the storm, and I cannot certify that stall for winter occupancy." "Can you move him to another stall?" "All other suitable spaces are committed." "Can you delay a week and repair it?" I looked through the office window at Amos, standing near the south end of the barn. "No, I cannot offer that stall for this winter." Mara was disappointed, not unreasonable. The owner had planned transport and passed on other space after paying the advance. Mara told me she would call 2 facilities west of us, but she needed the refund released immediately. I returned the $1,500 that day. That refund was not a separate loss on top of the contract. It was money received against the $4,500 total, then returned when we canceled. Counting it again would make the consequence sound larger than it was. The actual numbers were simple. I had spent $5,700 converting stall 12. I gave up $4,500 in contracted winter revenue. Together, the decision cost $10,200. The earlier roof repair had created the pressure that led me to use the stall, but I do not include its $12,400 invoice in that consequence. The roof needed repair regardless of what happened in 12. The new mats, liner, electrical work, and partition labor were the investment tied to my plan. The canceled layup was the income lost when I abandoned it. Some of the improvements remained useful, so an accountant could argue that the entire $5,700 was not wasted. That is fair. The mats did not disappear. The light still worked. But those dollars had been spent to prepare a winter stall I would no longer sell, and the business had to absorb them without the revenue meant to offset them. Amos did not tell me that I should have listened. He helped me remove the loose mat, dry the floor, and inspect the wall liner. He checked the slider track twice. The primary stop was intact. Nothing showed that the animal had operated the panel. A heavy outward or inward load, combined with wind and the absent secondary pin, remained enough to explain the changed position. "You want me to put the old rule back," I said. "It never went away." "It did for me." He considered that, then nodded. Restoring the rule did not require me to prove that the same animal had returned after 39 years. I had no way to know whether there had been one visitor or many, or whether the two incidents were related at all. I restored it because I now understood the space as an access conflict. In persistent snow and north wind, a large animal had entered once in my presence and perhaps once in Amos's. A horse in 12 would have reduced every safe option. I could lose one winter stall. I was no longer willing to risk filling it. We repaired the slider before the next storm. The replacement secondary stop arrived, and I had the contractor install it with a positive retaining pin. He realigned the lower guide and checked the full travel of the panel. The door could still open for maintenance, but it could not drift from the position I selected. We did not seal the exterior opening permanently. Stall 12 remained part of a working barn, and building codes, ventilation, and equipment access mattered. Nor did we leave it open as shelter. We placed no feed inside, made no trail toward it, and created no invitation for anything in the timber. The space became a seasonal separation bay. In spring, summer, and early fall, we can use it briefly when weather and operations allow. Once persistent snow covers the ground and wind begins coming off the north bench, it is removed from horse inventory. The interior door stays secured, the exterior slider stays shut and pinned unless maintenance requires otherwise. That is more specific than Amos's version, but it serves the same purpose. I wrote the procedure into the stable operations binder. I listed the weather trigger, the door inspection, and the vacancy requirement. I did not mention Bigfoot. An operating rule should still make sense to the next manager even if that person doubts every part of my account. No customer needed the full story. I told the regular boarders that the north stall had an exterior access issue during severe winter weather and would no longer be offered for seasonal boarding. That was true. It also prevented curiosity from turning our property into a place where strangers came looking for tracks. I considered adding cameras. The practical manager in me wanted coverage of the north apron, the slider, and the route to the timber. The part of me that had stood behind the service partition wanted proof that could separate memory from fact. I decided against a public investigation. Cameras would not make the stall safe for a horse. Announcing them or sharing a location could attract people carrying lights and weapons onto a property full of boarded animals. The value of an image did not outweigh the new risks created by chasing one. Amos accepted the written rule after reading it twice. "Too many words," he said. "It has to work when neither of us is here." He tapped the line requiring winter vacancy. "That part has enough words." We never agreed on what he saw in 1986. I believe it was the same kind of animal I saw, but kind is the strongest claim I can defend. 39 years is too long to call it the same individual, and Amos's view was too incomplete to identify it with certainty. I know what this account cannot give you. I was the only person who saw the adult Bigfoot inside the stall. Morning left an open slider, a shifted mat, dirty meltwater, forest debris, and wind-softened hollows. The records show a vacancy pattern and repairs beginning after Amos's earlier encounter. There is no photograph, sample, perfect track, or second witness to my night. For people who require those things, my story will not be enough. I understand that. Before December 17th, Amos's story would not have been enough for me either. It is August 2026 now, and I am 39. The north bench is green and stall 12 looks ordinary in daylight. The new liner is clean. The slider runs smoothly. The brass number still catches light at the end of the aisle. We have used the stall twice since spring, both times for short daytime separations with the exterior panel secured. Nothing unusual happened. That does not surprise me. Amos never claimed the stall was occupied every time its door opened. What changed is how I price uncertainty. A clean inspection can tell me that a mat lies flat, a guide is aligned, and a pin holds. It cannot tell me what may use that north route during a storm. Amos decided one vacant bay was cheaper than testing that difference with a horse inside. Now I make the same decision under my own name. I used to see the bare hook outside stall 12 as wasted space. Now I see a choice. When the next snow holds and the wind comes off the north bench, the brass plate will still say 12. The hook beneath it will remain bare because I chose to leave it that way.